Hello everyone, welcome to the review of Unit 3, Alike but Alienated. In the preview I talked about how Ukraine and Russia really are more alike than they are different, and how deep the roots connect between these two cultures, and how the Russian language links them, even though Ukrainian has its own language that if you know Russian, you get the gist of Ukrainian, and vice versa.
Gist.
Gist.
There's a lot of historical connections that really make this like a brotherly bond. In fact, many of the Soviet leaders either grew up in Ukraine, had many Ukrainian connections. For example, Khrushchev grew up in Ukraine, had a Ukrainian wife, even though he was a Soviet leader. Brezhnev, claimed himself or identified as Ukrainian, and even Gorbachev was also connected to Ukraine identity.
Identify as.
Identify as.
It really was this connection, even through Soviet times, of pride. Many people identified as Ukrainian or Russian and had no issue with that. Now, there was some more deeper historical context of negative things under Stalin in the 1930s, where Stalin essentially forced a famine to happen and starved many of the Ukrainians out of their wheat, essentially, a lot of the grain they produced. He forced a lot of farmers onto these collective farms, or they mass-produced it, and then he took it all to Russia, promising, kind of a stipend or help, but never gave it. 5 million lives were lost.
Famine.
Famine.
And that famine, situation was called Holodomor. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. And, well, that caused a lot of Ukrainians after that period to really resent Stalin, really resent Russia.
Right.
And so they kind of welcomed the Germans in 1941 when they invaded or came into the nation. And some people sided with Germany, fought for the German army or Nazis. And it's important to remember that 3 million, roughly, Ukrainians fought in the Red Army or Soviet Army against Germany, which ultimately Soviet Army, won. And, very recently in May, they kind of celebrated Victory Day, which is, Russia's defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. So many of these families and people in Ukraine resented those who sided with Germany, who kind of were sympathizers. And I think many nations from World War II and after, any sympathizer with the enemy, they don't quite connect. And there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of grudges between those people. So there's a lot of grudges, grievances, but there's even more connections, shared families, brothers and sisters, and parents and marriages across these borders. And it really links these two places together. And so the current situation ongoing is very sad and tragic for the history.
Grudge.
Grudge.
Grievance.
Grievance.
We really hope there could be some solution or solving of this, not for just their sake, but the world's sake, before this gets worse. So I wanted to kind of focus on the similarity question for you. Is if people from different countries and cultures have things more alike and similar, is that better for the people? Good for relations? What do you think?
I think it can go both ways. I think that similarities often do come from shared history, and shared history can be either good or bad. So we are here in Korea. I used to live in Japan. There are many similarities between Korea and Japan, whether you like to admit it or not. The languages, although not necessarily related, do have a lot of grammatic similarities and other things like that. They both take a lot of words from China, so there's similarities with China as well. Lots of architecture and other things that are all influencing each other. But they are not very good friends politically. because of their shared history
Yes.
and the bad aspects of their
Right.
shared history. So there were, times when they did share a lot of culture back and forth, but also times when there were, conquerors and occupations and all of those things. So in that situation, obviously, if your shared history is not a good history, then it can lead to grudges and bad feelings between countries. But in other cases, like the US and the UK, for example, we have a lot of similarities. A lot of UK culture came over to the US. We all speak English, so we have that in common. And I think that people like to joke about the traitors from the UK side and the bad kings and people in the UK on the American side, but I think that overall the relationship is more positive than negative. So it really depends on why you're so similar and what kind of shared history you have. How about you? Can you think of other examples of?
Wow, you said that so eloquently.
Thank you.
Well, I think now living here in South Korea, as you mentioned, the East Asia, its history is so intertwined and woven
Right.
together that, there is a tension and dislike deep between Japan and Korea, but there's also a mutual dislike for China. It's pretty deep, for the current things, but,
Very
it's complicated. And Korea and China have a historical dislike of Japan because of during World War I and II, the kind of occupation period. Terrible history. So there's this, there's times where they're siding together, times they're against each other.
Right. And they're so economically intertwined that they can't completely get rid of each other.
So as an American, it's really hard to fully grasp that if you don't live here, if you haven't been in these societies. Like you mentioned, America did have shared history in connection with England. And we joke about it, and I kind of feel like Canadians are just like the brother in a way. I don't feel too different from them at all.
Right.
Share the same language, culture's a little different, but we have a mutual history of against the British. So that's kind of a shared thing there. But U.S. and Great Britain are like one of the strongest allies or alliances we have. So they're closest to us. But I do think ultimately having a shared history can build a stronger bond. Whether that history is bad, if you can overcome those differences.
Right. Yeah.
But if it's really deeply, seeded, as in culturally rooted, it might be impossible to overcome, and always tension, always fighting.
Very difficult.
Yeah. So we'll have to wait and see, and I hope there is a solution, as I mentioned, to some peace treaty or something to come about that's better for everybody in this situation. But thank you all for joining us on our review, and we hope to see you on the next one.